Pseudopod is extruded into this universe from a dimension of purest fear. It's beautiful in its own alien way, but what's to come will unsettle you. Pseudopod, episode 777, October 1st, 2021. This week's story, Flash on the Borderlands 58, Graveyard Smash. Hello everyone, and welcome to Pseudopod, the weekly horror podcast. And before we go any further, I, Alistair, your host, would like very much to welcome aboard the amazing Kat Day, who is now formally part of the team as our new assistant editor. Kat does amazing work, and I'm really excited to work with her in this new role, especially after all the fun we've had up to this point. So, good job, Kat. Welcome to the team. Officially, again. Nicely done. This week we have 3 Flash pieces for you as part of Flash on the Borderlands. This is Graveyard Smash, where death and life have no meaning, or at least not the one you expect. And I can think of no better place to start than with Margaret Sinclair and the family. This story was originally published in January 1950 in Weird Tales. Sinclair was an American science fiction writer who, beginning in the late 40s, wrote and published by her own count some 130 short stories. Sinclair wrote that she first tried her hand at detective and mystery stories, and even these so-called quality stories, before finding her niche writing fantasy and SF for pulp. Unlike most pulp writers, I have no special ambitions to make the pages of the slick magazines. I feel that the pulps at their best touch a genuine folk tradition and have a balladic quality which the slicks lack. That's really cool. You can find more details of her at the link in the show notes, and your reader for this story is Simon Meddings. So, get ready to find out if all those stories about the family you've heard really are true.
The Family by Margaret St. Clair, narrated by Simon Meddings. Perhaps David really loves her, Mother said indecisively. We wouldn't want our boy made unhappy, you know. Kate threw back her head and laughed. The lamplight glinted brightly on her long, strong teeth. Of course he does, she cried in a raucous voice. Of course he does. Desperately, enormously. Otherwise, why would he want to marry her? From the ceiling of the dim-raftered room came the obedient echo. Marry her. Marry her. Kate's always been in love with her brother, Lance said from the other side of the room. Lance was thin. David had never known anyone as thin as Lancelot. She really must learn to watch out for it. Our family's name's Zizek, not Volsung, Catherine. Everyone laughed. A bright glance of understanding of shared familiar mirth rippled from face to face. Only Kate, rumbling in her throat, refused to see the joke. No offence meant, Catherine, Lance said with a touch of haste. None at all. But it was agreed long ago that David was the one, the only one of us who could pass for more than a day in the outside world. He has certain qualities which make him remarkably outstandingly attractive to the opposite sex. There's no occasion for heartburning. Whatever it is, he does. He does for us. But if he really loves her, Mother repeated, staring down at the worn greenish webs on her hands. If he really does. It was time for David himself to speak. I like her, yes, he admitted. More than I did any of the other ones, but that makes it all the better. As Lance said, whatever I do for the family. Oh, you're a good boy, David, Mother said with a smile. What would we do without you? Year after year you always provide. The others nodded in generous acknowledgement. David flushed with pleasure. What did anyone, even Elaine, matter when weighed against this? There won't be any trouble, though, will there? Mina asked anxiously. You remember what happened 2 years ago? No, David replied. Not if David prepared things, Kate said warmly. Dear brown David. David is so clever. We can rely on him. She came up to him and began rubbing her head against his sleeve, her eyes half closed. Pleased, he reached out and stroked her short, stiff hair on the top of her head. He had always liked Kate. And she's coming, Mother asked, getting up from her chair. tomorrow night. The nervous moment was always when they entered the house. Mother might air it, sweep, dust, polished. Still it remained odd. That troublesome gunning girl 2 years ago had sniffed and said it had a peculiar odour. But Elaine walked through the door without a murmur. Positively, she seemed to like the house. "You're to help her dress, Kate," David said, meeting his sister on the stair. "She said you had pretty eyes. But remember, don't take your bandana off. We don't want to frighten her." "I'll remember," Kate answered ardently. "Oh, David, she's ever so nice. I like her. I like her too." Her throat throbbed. "Good." David gave a little push. "Don't forget." Everything was ready in the cellar, the black-draped altar, the black tapers, the big brass bowl. David felt gratitude invade him. Everything was going so well, with such seamlessness, such decency. He hated inadequacies and scenes. The gunning girl's behaviour had been an ugly blotch on an ancient ritual, but there would be nothing of that tonight. He felt a sweet inner surety. Mother came down the steps while he was still kneeling. "I forgot the henbane," she explained. "Mina was worrying." She took a fat-bodied flask of mottled greenish pottery from a cupboard. "David, you're sure it won't be too hard on you, giving Elaine up?" "No, he—" David nodded in the direction of the altar. "He likes it better that way." "I know." Sympathetically, she took his hand in her cold, indented one. "Dear David," she said. Elaine was wonderful at dinner that night. She ate, she drank, without urging, laughed at Lance's jokes, seemed not to notice Mother's hands. And how beautiful she was! Her arms were whiter than ivory, than parchment, against the black stuff of her dress. Her mouth was dark wine. Her hair shone like black satin on her head. Kate, who was serving, was obviously enchanted with her. Once she forgot and rubbed slowly against Elaine, and Elaine brightly, affectionately smiled up at her. Now came the delicate moment. Delicate in spite of the henbane, which should have made Elaine responsive and suggestible, when Mother suggested they go downstairs. But Elaine stood up if one's prospective mother-in-law always invited one to visit the cellar after a meal. The cellar stairs had been mended since last year. That distressing squeak was gone. Solidly, Mother descended. Gracefully, Elaine followed her. Even Mina, silent. The others trooped after them. At the bottom of the stair, Elaine halted. This was the place at which the gunning girl 2 years ago had screamed and tried to run. It was certainly a delicate moment. But then the evening would be composed of delicate moments, one after another, up to the piercing deliciousness of the last, most transcendently delicate of all. Elaine turned her head to David. "How beautifully you've arranged everything," she said. Had her eyes widened a little before she spoke, David found himself wondering. She had spoken with the practical graciousness of a royal personage, and like the Queen's loyal subjects, the listeners behind had responded to her, looking at each other and smiling with pride. Their eyes glistened as bright as those of bats. Or had the cellar's traditional decor found her utterly without surprise? David would like to ponder this point, but he had no time. Elaine was moving slowly towards the altar, and he felt the others pushing him after her by pressure, which was as much psychic as it was actual and physical. The train of worshippers moved across the floor in a slow, skirling dance, while the altar receded and space itself seemed to flap around them giddily. Then David and Elaine were on firm ground once more, and facing the crest with the impaled toad. The chanting came softly up to them. Elaine let her cape glide slowly from her shoulders to the ground. In the light of the black candles her skin shone like alabaster, and she drew her midnight hair down from its pins. Kate, David could see her heavy body from the corner of his eye, gave a little skip and moaned deliriously. Wonderful Elaine. He loved her. They were all in love with her. He felt himself flooded by an emotion that was only the more poignant because he could not be sure whether it was basically anguish or bliss. The chanting grew louder. It was time. Half stifling, David took over the role of celebrant. He was submerged in emotion, drowning in it. In the midst of his passion, he clung desperately to the words and symbols of the ritual, and wonderfully, unbetrayingly, the rite mounted from climax to climax in the old vertiginous way. There came the moment when he picked up the knife. "Kneel," he said to beautiful, wonderful Elaine, and Elaine, smiling faintly, reached out and took the knife from him. Did Kate gasp? No, there came no sound. And the strangest thing was that there was not the least change of emphasis. Even when he knelt and she held the basin before his throat, the strangest thing was that nothing was in the least strange. No, not even there was there strangeness. Whatever he had done had been done for the family. Year after year he had provided. Tonight too he would provide. The knife in Elaine's hand was descending. Relaxed and gratified, David closed his eyes.
As a lot of you know, I like trying to isolate the exact location of the horror, and here it's hiding in plain sight. The careful use of the family banter gives way to the slow realization of what they do, and that lulls you into a false sense of security. You see the monster. You know where it is and where it's coming from. You don't feel safe, but you do feel like you're on solid ground. Until the ending, and the realization that this is a family built on violence, but defined by love. The ending here is a sacrifice, a release, a redemption, a mercy. It's brutal, and it's inexcusable and horrific, and comes from a place so broken everyone thinks it's love. And who knows, it may be. The monster at the end of this story gets to go home, or be destroyed. Perhaps they're the same thing. That brings us to The Devil's Graveyard by G.G. Pendarvis. Pendarvis has been a visitor here before, and this is an abridged version of The Devil's Graveyard, which first appeared in Hutchinson's Mystery Story magazine in December 1924, and was reprinted 2 years later in August 1926 in Weird Tales. As this was originally published as a novelette and a bit long for Pseudopod, staff turned this into an abridgment project to see if we could cut out, trim some of the fat and keep the core of the story. Ultimately, we wound up keeping the climactic scene, as we think it's pretty awesome and stands well enough on its own. My understanding is we'll have a link to the full text for you as well, so you can compare and contrast. Pendarvis was the nom de plume, the lovely phrase, of Gladys Gordon Trenery. Time has erased most traces of her other than her stories, although there are some excellent theories over on the blog Tellers of Weird Tales. Trenery contributed Yesterday, Today and Tomorrow to the Horn Book, November 1931, and otherwise all of her known stories were in Argosy All-Story magazine, The Magic Carpet magazine, Oriental Stories, and Weird Tales, all from 1926 to 1939. Her last 3 stories in The Unique magazine were published posthumously as Gladys G. Trenery, and she died on August 1st, 1938. That sad event was lost amongst the deaths of Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft from the previous 2 years. And this is your humble host's eloquent silence over what that says about the landscape of the industry from a cultural point of view at that time. Moving on. Your reader this week is the magnificent Jimmy Horrors, aka James Barnett. Jimmy is the creator, host, producer of the Night's End podcast, a short fiction podcast with tales of horror and the paranormal. Search for it wherever you get your podcasts. You can also catch other works of his at jamesbarnettcreative.com or the Night's End podcast at nightsendpodcast.com. So once again, G.G. Pendarvis, or perhaps the brilliant author wearing the G.G. Pendarvis hat, and Jimmy have a story for you, and all our research says it's true.
The Devil's Graveyard. Written by G.G. Pendarvis. Narrated by James Barnett. Over the jagged spine of rock which crested the hill known as the Devil's Teeth in that neighbourhood, the great reddened orb of a harvest moon rose like the eye of some gigantic Polyphemus, peering down on that unhallowed spot with wide, unblinking stare, eager to witness once again the triumph of deathless hate, to gloat with full-orbed vision on the resurrection of all that was evil and abominable. Fremling and Radcliffe stood watching the rising of this ill-omened moon, the younger man with beating heart and a feeling of helpless terror, which made his hands and feet icy cold, and the breath come short and quick through his nostrils. His nervous excitement was in strong contrast to the calm of his companion, who looked alternately from his watch to the heavy shadow cast by the hill, a shadow retreating gradually like some furtive guilty thing, back into the bulk of the hill. Fremling drew from his pocket a roll of parchment yellow with age, and consulted it narrowly. "In half an hour's time, according to this manuscript," he said, "the outline of the grave should be distinct, and we shall learn the exact spot where Giles's blood was shed. It is there we must meet the demon soul which possesses your brother's body, and it is there alone we can destroy it." A long shudder shook David's body as he looked furtively around the trees which encircled the open grassy space. He watched the inky shadow of the hill until its sharp outline became hazy and indistinct, and the whole scene swam in a pale mist before his aching eyes. For a moment he shut them to recall Maisie's face, to nerve himself by the thought of her love and belief in him to face what was coming. The low exclamation from Fremling made his heart stop beating. Then his pulses throbbed furiously as he followed the direction of the other's pointing finger. A luminous red stain, its shape unmistakable and sinister, was growing momentarily more distinct there on the grass in front of them, not 6 feet distant. Every leaf and blade of grass or weed within that rectangular boundary gleamed red as blood and fiery bright. Sir Donald picked up from the ground a short, broad-bladed sword, worn and stained, its hilt encrusted with rubies, whose fire outshone even the crimson glare of the grave itself. "Dig swiftly," he commanded, putting the weapon in the young man's hands. "Do not lose a moment. All depends now on your speed. Before midnight that grave must lie open to the moon and stars, or we shall meet Giles, unprepared and helpless." Urged and goaded by repeated warnings, David pursued his dreadful task. The red grass came up easily enough, being rooted in a light powdered soil of the same deep red stain as the grass itself. As the last sod of that stained weed was cut up and tossed aside, Fremling drew David quickly back from the graveside. As he did so, a great tremor shook the whole place, and a tongue of fire shot with a hissing roar skyward from the uncovered grave. When it died, Fremling went forward and peered cautiously into the grave, beckoning David to his side. Clutching the older man with icy hands, the other looked and drew back with a gasp. A dark shaft had opened, reaching to unfathomable depths, in whose yawning chasm a far-off point in green light burned like an evil star of the underworld. David recoiled with ashen face, while Sir Donald's firm mouth set in its sternest lines. "It is Gaffarel the Mighty, Gaffarel and the 4 ancient ones who come against us," he whispered to his trembling companion. "This place is saturated with unspeakable guilt." His eyes closed for a minute, as he muttered a few low indistinct words. Then taking from his pocket a small phial, he turned to David again, and with a certain rare and fragrant oil, he rapidly anointed the eyes, nose, and mouth of his companion and himself. "I warn you," Fremling said, "to wait in silence now for what shall come. Do not utter a syllable, or you will plunge us both into the devil's tomb where Giles and his legions await us." Chill eddies of wind swept up against the silent pair as the midnight hour approached. The ground under their feet trembled with the thundering march of some invisible army. The sound of countless hoarse voices and echoing horrid laughter came faintly to their ears. Fremling drew forth a rod of ancient ivory, carved with the symbols of magic as old as the dawn of the world. Its tip gleamed with pale fire, and as Sir Donald traced on the ground the outline of the sacred pentacle, the rank grass burned fiercely in its wake, and within the fiery five-pointed star, David and Fremling stood by the graveside, waiting. Strange flickering lights moved along the trees, which hemmed them in. Shadows formed and reformed in sinister array about them. The chill of death gripped David's heart, and he turned to look at his companion, standing upright and steadfast, his face raised to the midnight sky, his lips moving rapidly. Suddenly all noise and movement ceased abruptly, and in the intense stillness, David nerved himself for the last supreme effort. To face Giles the Thruster, to defy him, to pit his own will against the awful power of the demon. It was coming. Coming. In every nerve, he felt the dread approach of the enemy. With cold lips he murmured over to himself the ancient words of power that Fremling had taught him, and with shaking fingers pressed a leaf of vervain to his nostrils. There, upon the open grave stood Giles, a gigantic shadow, his beckoning figure drawing David with irresistible lure. Like one in a trance, David took a stiff step forward, but here he could move again. Fremling advanced swiftly and interposed his own body between the monstrous shadow and its victim. At this, the baleful lights outside the pentacle drew closer, and dim forms were visible, bestial and uncouth, surging forward with horrid effort to pass the barrier of fire. Fremling stood as though carved in stone. Not a step did he give back. As with almost imperceptible movement, Giles advanced upon him. There was not a hand's breadth between them when Fremling held up the fire-tipped rod, and in a loud, clear voice commanded Giles to return to the place whence he came. 3 times Sir Donald repeated the terrible name, which can command even the ancient four themselves, and slowly Giles the Thruster retreated, his hate powerless against the divine courage of his antagonist. Inch by inch Sir Donald advanced. Inch by inch Giles moved backward to the grave. Sir Donald's face was awful in its set intensity, his steady eyes fixed on the flaming eyeballs of the demon who opposed him. Good and evil matched in a colossal struggle for supremacy. Back over the brink of the grave Giles was forced, and then, with the swiftness of light, Fremling raised the magic rod and plunged its blazing tip deep into the thruster's heart. A great tongue of flame shot up from the fathomless depths of the grave, wrapping around Giles like a winding sheet of fire, and in that same moment the phantom lights that pressed about the pentacle vanished utterly. The blazing star itself dimmed and went out. David gripped his companion's arm convulsively as they waited. The black clouds overhead were torn by the blinding glare, followed by crash after crash of thunder, shaking the solid earth. Then came the rain, sudden and torrential, washing the evil off the haunted spot from off the earth, and Fremling and Radcliffe lifted their faces thankfully to its cleansing sweetness. At last it ceased, the darkness lifted, and from a ragged fringe of cloud the moon shone, dear and bright. Grass and trees glistened with the silvery sparkle of some enchanted forest. How strangely altered was that sullen ring of trees, that ragged, haunted, desolate spot, not haunted now, quiet and lonely, perhaps, but not desolate. A calm, sweet peace brooded over the place. The threatening copse had become a friendly shelter from the storm, where the birds cowered and shook their wings, piping encouragement to one another as they dried their wet feathers. The circle of grass was wholly green. No red stain now, nor gaping depth was there. Green and fragrant the weeds, and long waving grasses shone in the moonlight.
There are two things to consider here, and the first is linear time. Sometimes that just messes us all up. It's entirely possible that this may just be me, that I am the only one of us with a giggling 12-year-old schoolboy inside my mind, but the unfortunate truth is, it's there, and as a result it's hard to take a name like Giles the Thruster seriously, especially in the UK, in a modern setting. Now, this is not me winkingly saying, ha ha ha, old stories are dumb. That is not what I'm doing here. What this is me pointing out that times change, and our perceptions of language change with those times. The thing is, though, once you move past that, this is a really impressive piece of writing. The idea of the grave manifesting is impressive enough, as is the visceral nature of the environmental impact it brings with it. But most of all, what gets me here is that this is less an exorcism and more a rescue mission. Death is not the end, but death can be an end, and this story and its characters both acknowledge that and refuse to let it be so. It's a brave, massive concept to swing at. I'd like to encourage you to read the non-abridged version, the text of which will be available on the website, hopefully by the time you read this. So, one story where what and who the monster is depend on where you stand. Another where the hardest line of all is ignored in the name of familial love. And finally, a story where the most wonderful night of the year, the night that so many of us sometimes wish would never end, well, Endless Halloween comes to us from Michael Kelly. It originally appeared in Supernatural Tales 44 in August 2020. Michael is the former series editor for the year's Best Weird Fiction. He is a Shirley Jackson and BFA award-winning editor and a 4-time World Fantasy Award nominee. His fiction has appeared in a number of journals and anthologies, including Black Static, Nightmare Magazine, The Mammoth Book of Best New Horror, and has previously been collected in Scratching the Surface, Undertow and Other Laments, and All the Things We Never See. He is the owner and editor of Undertow Publications and editor of Weird Horror Magazine. Your reader for this week is David Dark. David is a 35-year-old voice actor from Ogden with 5 kids. He has a passion for all things horror, from gaming to books and audio and more. His Twitter is David Dark Voice, and listeners can also hear him on the fantastic SCP Archive Season 3, as well as occasionally on the also fantastic Tales to Terrify. So, let's go trick-or-treating. After all, it's the most wonderful night of the year. We all know that's true.
Endless Halloween by Michael Kelly. Everything was dark. You've come back. For a time, after Carly, everything went dark, and you went away. But now you are back for one last trick-or-treat. Tonight, the moon is a bright, sharp sickle. Briefly, there is a strange, indigo stillness, as if the world is holding a purple breath. But then a chill gust of wind brushes past, and you think you hear peals of laughter or nervous screams, and you're back, blinking into the void of your former childhood. Everything is the same. Everything is different. Across the street is the parquet where you and Carly first kissed, each seated in a rusty swing, leaning sideways to touch lips, to touch hearts. Now, the leather seat of one swing hangs loose, flapping in the night breeze like a broken batwing. Beyond the parquet, past the ancient climbing bars, is the slim trail snaking into the woods. The shortcut to school, now overgrown with creeper vines and impassable. Behind you, on the corner of the block in the little strip mall, is Gino's Pizza, the iconic neon pizza sign sputtering, one pepperoni slice having winked out, the tang of salty grease in the air. Next to Gino's is McClatchy's funeral parlor, dark and shuttered, like the coffins inside. Turning, you glance the other way and see a large, gnarly oak on the Kelvins' front lawn, more twisted than you remember, skeletal branches reaching across the road. You stand alone on the sidewalk, beside a silent hedgerow, tall and dark. October is the lonely country, you think. You have shrouded yourself in a simple bedsheet. You don't want to be recognized. Not that anyone is expecting you. Truth be told, you're probably too old for trick-or-treating. Trauma ages everyone, even the young. You remember that night. Some of it, at any rate. And this is what you remember. That night was orange and black and filled with autumn. Mounds of damp leaves like freshly dug graves. Sulphurous wood smoke trailing from red brick chimneys. The pungent rot of grinning pumpkins on wooden porches. And capering ghosts and cackling witches scuttling along rain-slicked sidewalks. A time of innocence, you'd think. But it wasn't. Not really. You'd survived the summer of Sam. Then someone in Atlanta killed a bunch of children. Another kid had died in the woods near your school. There was cyanide and Tylenol in Chicago. Still. Halloween. And you quivered with anticipation. And for one glorious night, you could forget the rest of the world. You could chance a few razor blades and apples. And there was Carly, of course. And she was 13 years old. And you loved her so. You knew it. With all your young, bursting heart. It was first love. The love like no other. The love that blooms fresh, yearning and trembling, and scary. The love that hurts. Watch out for my girl, Carly's mom had said. Watch out for my little Red, she said. As Carly, smiling brightly, stepped off the porch in her hooded and swirling candy apple red cape, a dervish of excited energy. And you could only gawp stupidly at such beauty, before stuttering, I will, with my life. You stood on the wet ground, stamping your feet, grinning behind a tattered bedsheet, your heart pounding, as the wind sang a wet and gurgling song of knives and teeth. In love. You were in love. And now, the night seemed endless, full of mystery and strange wonder, and you grinned and grinned. Reaching out, you took Carly's hand. She flashed a smile and did a skip, pulled you along. Her happiness stops you dead. Then you both race along the wet, leaf-strewn pavement, laughing, the capricious cedar-scented wind pushing you as you collected treats, and the occasional trick from monsters and demons and ghouls in their haunted spiderweb-bedecked houses. You could almost believe the monsters were real. After a time, your sack was heavy. You opened it, peered in at the chocolate bars, the bags of potato chips, the caramel candies, the bubble gum. You looked up, and suddenly, you were alone. And the mad grin slipped from your face. Where was Carly? Then you heard the creak, creak of the rusted chains of the swing, and a sudden angry gust of wind blustered, and you saw a flash of red. Carly! You sprinted across the street to the parquet, to the swing set, and dropped your candy-laden sack. You pushed the sheet up off your face. Carly, you said, softly. You scared me. Then, don't ever leave me. Carly planted her feet, stared at you intently, eyes sparkling, even in the lonesome dark. There's nothing to be afraid of, silly, Carly said, and leaned in and kissed you, tender. You trembled. The Irvings are giving out cans of soda, you said. They're on Poplar Street. Carly scrunched up her face. It's all the way around the block. We can cut through the woods, you said. Come out on Poplar. Too dark, Carly said. Besides, I heard they found some bones in the woods. Human bones. You laughed uncertainly, trying to remember. That can't be true. Probably just a dead fox or something. Carly stood, held out her hand. Okay, but don't let go. And here your memory is. You both stepped into the woods, holding hands, following the winding trail. You and Carly. You and Little Red. You remember joking about wolves. You moved along the dirt path, dead leaves crunching underfoot, clutching Carly's hand. The wind had died. Everything went silent, tomb-like. Dark. So dark. You stumbled along the path, into the darkening woods, and something scraped your arm, tangled in your sheet. Something thin and skeletal. A branch. You shivered. Carly giggled, nervous. And the wind picked up again, soft. But not the wind. No. A faint rasping from behind you. Dry and ancient. Just the wind, you thought. Hurrying, you both moved further into the dark wood. If you could just get to the other side. It had to be close. And the deeper you went, the darker it got. Crack! The sound of a branch snapping. And then another crack behind you. A crunching noise like footsteps. Something moans. Carly gasps. The night, you think. The night is alive. Snap! Closer. Closer. Then those thin and sinewy branches grab you. Not branches. Arms and hands. Pulling. Clutching. Smothering. Carly is wrenched from your grasp, and there's a short scream. Then an eerie blue silence descended, and there's a rapid dimming. And then everything went dark, and you went away. And Carly was lost to the woods. And now? Now you're like a ragamuffin, lost and alone without Carly. You don't know why you've come back, or even how. Penance of some sort, you guess. Closure. You're not even carrying a sack. You're just another ghost on a night full of ghosts, wandering lost. You move down the sidewalk, following the imperious hedgerow to the end of the street. The wind blows, making the trees sing, mournful. The sky is dark and starless. The moon is a glowing crescent, like a lidded eye. You turn the corner. Ghouls and skeletons and witches pass you by, paying you no heed. Then you are in front of Carly's house. Don't ever leave me, you'd said. A creak, and the front door opens, and there, impossibly, is Carly. She's with someone, a sheeted figure, and she's smiling, happy, coming down the porch steps. And if you had a heart still, it would splinter into a million slivers, to be scattered to the cruel October wind. Carly! Your mind is a wild tumult, dimming. She's coming towards you, her and her ghost companion. You lift your arm to wave, but it's caught in the sheet. And how will she recognize you? How will she see you? Frantic, you tear at the sheet, pull it off, and the wind catches it and spirits it away. You wave, try to speak, but nothing emerges but a faint, muffled choking, as if your mouth is packed full of dirt. and Carly and the ghost walk past you. You turn to go after her, to get her attention, but she's laughing now. That joyous childhood Halloween laugh that drifts on October winds. She's skipping, and her happiness stops you dead. You blink, and the indigo silence returns, and everything darkens. And before you know it, you are at the trail entrance again. As the wind sings, as the chains twist and moan and creak, as branches crack and snap, and you're staring at the tangle of vines and creepers and the darkness beyond. Impassable, but not for you. Never for you. And you enter, and everything is dimming, and now you've gone away, and everything is dark.
Just another ghost on a night full of ghosts. That is a line that rings like a bell. As does the way this story both explores what happens when trauma is the fire in which we burn, and when something we love is corrupted, befouled. Halloween, for all its horror, is a safe space these days, and I mention that term with no pejorative intent whatsoever, with no sneering. That's not what we do here. The fact it is safe, the fact that it is fun, speaks, to me at least, to a deeply healthy willingness for us to embrace our trauma and our fears, and where possible, to make something enjoyable out of them, or at least hopeful. Here, even that is denied as the lead character is run through the final night his life mattered, again and again. The encounter with the unknown, with the impossible, is one which smashes his world to pieces, one which holds him forever, that he never recovers from. There is always an end, but there is never the end. There is always the woods. It is always Halloween. It is always just about to happen again. What a haunting, complex story, and what a way to sign off these three pieces. Thank you all. We're now paying associate editors, who are slush readers, and the first line of contact for every magazine and author. They are the unsung heroes of the industry, so we're singing them. We're currently paying all 4 shows associate editors at a reduced rate because we aren't quite at the target donation level yet, but it was time to get this done. So, we still need your help, especially as in addition, donations pay for, well, how can I put this, literally everything else. Seriously, stories, staff, tech, you name it. Donations pay for it, so thank you. And if you can please either donate time or money, that would be incredibly helpful. Time's actually really easy. Did you like this story? Then talk about it on social media. Leave a review on your podcatcher of choice. Anything like that helps like you would not believe. Literally, the only thing that helps more is money. You can subscribe and get free audio goodies galore from as little as $5 a month through either Patreon or PayPal. And if you have Amazon Prime, with 5 minutes you can support us with $5 a month for free through Twitch. It's a little fiddly, but don't worry, we've got you covered. There is a walkthrough at escapeartists.net/Twitch, which will tell you everything you need to know. Apart from this, that next week we will be hosting the amazing Live from the End of the World by Frank J. Orito, read by Katie Gill, audio produced by the amazing Marty, and hosted by me. Then, as now, will be a production of Escape Artists Inc. and released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. And our closing quote this week is from the amazing James Baldwin. People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. We'll see you next week, folks. Until then, have fun. Pseudopod, episode 778, October 8th, 2021. This week's story, Live from the End of the World by Frank J. Orito. Hello everyone, welcome to Pseudopod, the weekly horror podcast. I'm Alistair, your host, and this week's story comes to us from Frank J. Orito. Frank is a writer of weird fiction living in the wilds of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His strange tales have appeared or are upcoming in Darkness Delight, Fear the Future, Flame Tree Press's Beyond the Veil, and a menagerie of fantasy and science fiction. But the first story he ever sold was to us. Aww. And the second story he ever sold was to us. Aww. And for those early encouragements, he is forever grateful. You are most welcome, Frank, and thank you for those amazing pieces of fiction. You are most welcome, Frank, and thank you for those fantastic stories. Your narrator this week is Catherine Gill. Katie Gill is a librarian and budding horror writer-performer who has strong opinions about Dead Explorers, Eurovision, and public domain works. She can be found at Katie Beluga on Twitter and has previously been published at The Singles Jukebox, Anime Feminist, and Women Write About Comics. We've got both names for her here, Marty, so I'll just do the intro line again. Your reader for this week is Katie Gill. Now, coming to you live from the end of the world, thanks to Frank, thanks to Katie, to Marty, and me. Well, we have a true story for you. Oh, this one hits me where I live. I always love news-based horror, but what really gets me here is the subversion of expectation, and how much of a continuing theme that is from last week. Better still, here it's used as a means of moving the story subtly through the genres. What starts off played relatively straight becomes the sort of gonzo pseudo-weird horror you'd expect Nicolas Cage to star in the movie version of, and then just as you get comfy with that, it changes gear again, and in doing so strikes a deep, bass note of emotion and humanity. The horror here is simple and easy to see. What's less obvious is that horror is also the tragedy, and it starts with Wanda saving her friends from what's coming. That level of nuance, the realization not just that you've done wrong, but that there is nothing to do, and you were probably right to do it anyway as far as you're concerned, is horrific and complex and real. People are self-destructive, complicated, really bloody odd. Wanda is the woman who killed the world. Wanda is also someone who loves her friends. Wanda also saves our hero and heroine. Wanda is also a murderer. Wanda also saves our intrepid journalists. And Wanda is also a murderer. But where the story twists the knife so gracefully, so beautifully for me, is in the final beats. Harriet and Pete changed forever by what they've seen and what they're about to see. Getting the thing they've always dreamed of, the big story, the biggest story of them all, the one that will make their careers as it unmakes the world. And they go anyway. On one level, it's pure arrogance. On another, it's a coping mechanism. Faced with the last thing they'll ever do, they cling to what they know. But for me, unsurprisingly, there's another element to this. There's another element to this. Kindness. These two journalists, faced with the last ever event, decide that the best thing they can do is what they know how to do. Inform people. Spread the word. Put face and context on the thing that has neither. Is it arrogant? Absolutely. Is it compassionate? Utterly. And it's the complex, nuanced dynamo that drives this remarkable story. Thank you all. We're now paying associate editors. They are also known as slash readers, and they're the first line of contact for every magazine and author. They're the unsung heroes of the industry, and we, with your help, are doing something about that. We're currently paying all 4 shows associate editors at a reduced rate because we aren't quite at the target donation yet, but it was time to get this done, so we're doing it. Now, I imagine you saying, how can I help, Alistair? Well, I'm glad you asked. There are 2 ways you can help. The first and most obvious one is to donate money. The best way to do that is you can subscribe for as little as $5 a month, either through Patreon or PayPal. That gets you all kinds of audio goodies, and there are extra tiers on the Patreon as well. Alternatively, if you have 5 minutes, you could support us with $5 a month for free if you have an Amazon Prime account via Twitch. Now that's a little complex, but don't worry. There is a walkthrough at escapeartists.net/Twitch, which will show you everything you need to do. Alternatively, if you've got the time, you like this story, write a review of it, link to it, talk about it on social media, talk to us, have us on for interviews, write a piece about the shows, anything like that. We love doing that kind of stuff. So if you're at all interested in doing it, do please get in contact. And for all those of you who do help, thank you. Join us next week for Towel Brush Bone by Audrey R. Hollis, narrated by Iba Amankas, audio produced once again by the inimitable Marty, and hosted by me. Then, as now, will be a production of Escape Artists Inc. and released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives license. And our closing quote this week, which will surprise none of you, I'm quite sure, comes from the amazing Pontypool. It's not the end of the world. It's just the end of the day. Thank you, folks. See you next time.
It's a pseudopod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.